The election campaign is only a week old. Yes, I know, it seems longer than that. And the parties say there's all to play for. They'll be saying that up until the votes are counted on the night. But unusually, who is not standing has become almost as important as who is.
The Brexit Party will not contest the 317 seats the Conservatives won at the last election. What we will do is concentrate our total effort into all of the seats that are held by the Labour Party.
Christmas came early for Boris Johnson when Nigel Farage withdrew his candidates from every Tory-held seat, prompted, he claimed, by these words from the Prime Minister.
We will not extend the transition period beyond the end of 2020. There's absolutely no need to do that.
Opposition parties were suspicious.
I don't think that the electorate like this sort of backroom deal.
Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage are joined at the hip.
It wasn't all going Mr Johnson's way. Former Cabinet Minister David Gauke had this advice for Tories.
Traditional Conservative voters like me should lend their support to the Liberal Democrats.
Took your time, Boris, haven't you?
Yeah, where you been?
Flooding in Yorkshire inevitably drew the attention of the party leaders.
You've just got to be putting in the flood defences.
Just imagine if this had happened in Surrey instead of Yorkshire.
It is wrong that it seems to be just down to the local communities. This is clearly a national emergency.
Leading American politicians can't seem to get enough of this British election. First to dabble was Donald Trump. Now this.
I find it inexplicable that your government will not release a government report about Russian influence.
Back on the campaign trail, the Conservatives cost Labour's spending plans.
These are eye-watering levels of spending, 1.2 trillion.
But so far, not their own spending plans.
I'm not going to get into individual policies today.
Labour said its manifesto would be fully costed and dismissed Tory calculations.
This is an absolute work of fiction by the Conservatives. You can't trust a word that Johnson and his ministers say.
I'll be speaking to the man who says he'll outspend the Tories on the NHS, Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth, and to the SNP about their demand for 2 referendums, if they are kingmakers after the election. Good evening. We're live from the heart of Westminster as politicians of all colours flood the country with campaign literature most of us will never read and guidance on how to vote most of us will proudly ignore. But there's an added complication. Normally in elections, politicians urge us to vote for their party. Not this time. At least not always. Some former Labour MPs are telling us to vote Conservative, not Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. A former Conservative minister who's standing as an independent urges us to vote Liberal Democrat. A Liberal Democrat candidate who's standing down tells the people of Canterbury to vote Labour. Nigel Farage urges voters to vote BREXIT Party in Labour-held seats, but Conservative in Tory-held seats. Nigel Farage himself, well, he's not standing, so you can vote for him even if you wanted to. And he says he might vote Conservative. Confused? We are. But don't worry, stay tuned for the next half hour. You might not learn much, but I can guarantee you we won't be telling you how to cast your vote. I'm joined now by the Shadow Health Secretary, Labour's John Ashworth. Good evening. This morning you told the BBC it was nonsense to suggest that the NHS was part of Labour's plan to move towards a 4-day work week. A few hours later, the Shadow Chancellor made it clear the NHS was very much part of Labour's plan to get to a 32-hour week within a decade. Now that it's evening, have you got a grip on your party's policy?
Well, it is nonsense to suggest that there'll be a mandatory 4-day week in the NHS. I was correct when I said that was nonsense. That is still the case. Well, let me just finish at the point, and then I'm sure you'll come back at me. What we've said today is that the allegation that was put to us that somehow in the first year of a Labour government, I would be saying to the NHS, to the staff, you would have a 4-day week, is palpable nonsense. We've got to build up capacity in the NHS. That's why I was announcing more money for the NHS today, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But John McDonnell more broadly has said he wants us to move to a position over the next 10 years when average working hours across the whole economy move from 37 hours a week down to 32 hours a week.
Including the NHS?
Well, the NHS will be involved in those calculations, because when the NHS employs over 1 million staff, of course they'll be involved in those calculations. But that is different from saying to the NHS, here is a top-down rule that all the staff will be working 4 days a week. Not least because, and people are right to look askance at me like you are doing, that would entail us finding something like 300 million extra hours in the NHS.
Right, but I want to show our viewers what you told BBC Breakfast this morning. Just listen to this.
So you say that you are going to look at this plans for a 4-day week. Would the NHS, in the future, you're saying that it's in the future, be part of those plans?
No, we just said no, it's not happening. There's not a 4-day week coming in the NHS.
But it is happening. What you'd said there isn't true. John McDonnell said it will be done in a decade, and it will include the NHS. No, you both can't be right.
No, the positions are not contrary. Look, we are not imposing upon the National Health Service a mandatory 4-day week. What John McDonnell is saying, that across the economy as a whole...
Including the NHS, which is the biggest employer in the country.
Yes, but he's saying that the hours that are worked in the NHS will be used within the calculations to produce the average hours worked across the economy as a whole. So when we go into the next set of negotiations with the 6 different groups of NHS staff, that's the Agenda for Change staff, the junior doctors, the senior staff, the consultants, they all have different negotiations, all have different bargaining negotiations. For example, the Agenda for Change negotiations will start again in 2021 when the current...
Right,
but that is when we will start a negotiation with staff about pay,
and you will
about
move
terms.
Towards a 4-day week.
Yeah, those things will be discussed in those negotiations.
John McDonnell says it will be done in a decade. He's the Shadow Chancellor. He says it will apply to everybody.
No.
Everybody includes the NHS.
In the calculations.
I understand that it's not, next week or on December the 13th, there'll be a 4-day week. That's a straw man. I understand that's not the case. But it does seem that John McDonnell intends to introduce a 4-day week, which will be complete within 10 years' time. Now, in the extra NHS spending you've announced, what allowance have you made to move towards shorter working weeks?
But we are not imposing a 4-day working week upon the National Health Service. We are saying that over the next 10 years, as we go into the next round of negotiations with the 6 different staff groups, which take time, these negotiations over terms and conditions take time, then working hours will be part of those discussions, as they have been in the past.
Are you against a 4-day week in the NHS?
Well, quite obviously, a 4-day week in the NHS at the moment is not realistic when staff themselves are working beyond the 37.5 contracted hours. Indeed. At the moment. NHS staff are actually working for free in the NHS.
And it would cost billions, wouldn't it?
Well, we would have to have a negotiation with staff when we discuss their pay, their terms and their conditions across the different bandings of staff in the NHS. And we would discuss with those staff that if productivity is increasing in the NHS, if the investment in technology and modern technology means that working patterns can change over the next 10 years, then yes, we can have a discussion about moving away from the contracted hours of 37.5 hours a week to something else. But saying there'll be a discussion and a negotiation with staff is completely different to saying here is a mandatory 4-day week coming in the NHS.
But John McDonnell says it will apply to everybody. You seem to say to everybody bar the NHS. Why would people want to stay in the NHS if elsewhere people are on a 4-day week?
Because, well, if I may say so, what John McDonnell is saying is that all the hours worked in the British economy will be part of the national calculation, because the 32 hours average he wants to get to is a national average figure.
And so the NHS will be working a lot more than that?
Well, in different sectors, there'll be different bargaining going on. That's the point.
People watching this tonight can only conclude that what you're saying and what John McDonnell is saying are two very different things.
No, I don't think they are, actually. What I am saying is that next year and the year after, and you're right, you recognise that's a straw man, that's the Tory party putting that out, that there will not be a 4-day week. I'm saying, as Health Secretary, as I go into the next stage of negotiations with NHS staff across the 6 different bands, that I am prepared to discuss working hours with them. But my priority is driving up capacity in the NHS at the moment, because, as you know, the waiting list at 4.5 million.
Indeed.
And
Have you told John McDonnell this?
Yes, and I do.
Has he had a little talk with you?
I do
He
not
asked
believe...
you for one of his famous cups of tea, perhaps?
I don't know, what are these famous cups of tea? Have you had
Okay,
one?
well, maybe you've got to find out. Let's come on to this spending. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn promised, and I quote him, the most ambitious and radical platform in this election ever. Ever. Why are you not delivering that for the NHS?
I think we are.
Well, let's have a look at... Let's look at what you and the Conservatives are offering. Sure. And let's start with current spending.
Sure.
Let's put capital spending to the side. Come back to that. It works out that the Tories are planning to spend, I talk in real terms, sure, an extra 3.2% a year under Mr Johnson. You, on current spending, are offering an extra 3.8% a year. So the difference is 0.6%. That's not very ambitious or radical.
No, we're off. No. If I may say so, that 3.2%, if the calculations that are the same calculations that I have made, do not include the cuts to public health budgets, and do not include the cuts to the HEE budgets. I believe that's NHS revenue budget. I think our 3.8% figure...
Your figures don't include public health either.
No.
These are figures for England. The Tories 3.2, you're 3.8. So 0.6% of a difference is your idea of ambitious and radical.
Well, we are investing more in public health budgets, which have been cut back. And actually, that increase in NHS revenue budgets that we have announced today will allow us to prioritise mental health services in a way in which they've never been prioritised before.
It's not that much more than the Tories. It's hardly the most ambitious ever.
But you know something, look, you'd expect a Labour spokesperson to come on your show and say we're going to spend more money than the Tories on the NHS. It's not just about the fact that we're spending more money, it's how we spend it. So we're spending more money on prevention, we're spending more money on mental health services in a way in which those areas have never been prioritised before. I do actually think that is quite radical. Look, when you've got life expectancy going backwards in some of the poorest parts of the country, when we've lost our measles-free status because vaccination rates have fallen, but we are spending more in these areas to keep people well, and keep them out of hospital.
Which means that other areas won't be getting that much of an increase. I mean, you'd also borrow to invest in the NHS. So I said I'd come on to capital spending. Yeah. Now, that takes the spending rise under your plans to 4.3% a year. It's more. But again, let's look at how that compares to spending under some previous prime ministers. Let's have a look at that. I mean, 4.3% under Jeremy Corbyn, 6.9% under Ted Heath, 6.1% under Tony Blair, 5.3% under Gordon Brown, 4.6% under John Major and Harold Macmillan. I mean, you're not even as ambitious and radical as Alec Douglas-Hume. He managed 5.9%.
Well, I believe that we are spending more than the current government, and because
that's not the argument. No. Your leader did not promise to spend more than the current government. He promised the most ambitious and radical platform ever. And when you look at these figures of previous prime ministers, you're near the bottom.
A percentage increase compared to Alex Douglas-Hume does not necessarily imply the most radical platform ever. We are radical because we're putting more money into mental health services. We're expanding a counselling service to every single secondary school, so the 100,000 children who don't get any support.
But the NHS itself needs more money too. If you're spending your 4.3% into areas that Ted Heath or even Tony Blair didn't touch, that's less for the core service.
Well, that's why the NHS revenue budget is rising by around 3.9% under us. So we are giving our hospitals and our doctors' surgeries more money as well. Yes, indeed.
How does it feel to come 7th in the league table of prime ministers spending money on the NHS?
But it's about where I'm spending the money. It's about where I'm spending the money.
No, that wasn't just that. It was spent. Your mantra, your party's mantra for the past decade has been the need to spend more. And you and I both know that average increases in NHS spending in the past 9 years have only been around 1 to 1.5%. This is what I don't understand. You see, your party is allocating, well, at the last election, you've said this, it will probably go up even more now, £11 billion to abolish student fees. Mainly to the benefit of the middle and upper middle class. You're going to spend £30 billion nationalising the national grid, which seems to be a priority for nobody outside the shadow cabinet. So the money is there, you got it to spend. Why won't you spend more on the NHS?
Because we are spending more in areas like mental health services, areas like prevention budget. drug and alcohol addiction services. We're seeing a phenomenon now in our country called deaths of despair, where more and more people are dying from suicide, from drug overdose, from alcohol-related abuses.
Then you need a lot more money than the 4.3%.
No, we're not. We're giving them a huge boost after years of cuts under the Tory party. Now, I don't think there's probably no votes in it, by the way. Because
well, that's another matter.
But that is a radical.
The efficacy
that is a
it.
radical intervention to help some of the most vulnerable in society.
Jeremy Corbyn wants to get rid of all private provision in the NHS. He said that he wants a health and social care service that is only fully publicly provided. What does that mean?
It means getting rid of the competitive tendering of contracts, which the Andrew Lansley Health and Social Care Act ushered in, where essentially every contract has to go out a process where private providers bid, and often private providers will win community health contracts, a children's health contract, for example, or a patient transport contract, for example.
Well, let me see if I can narrow this down. We buy all our drugs from the private sector.
Yeah.
That will continue.
Yes.
Our dentists are in the private sector.
Yes, although some of it is obviously NHS.
Of course,
for a
that will
contracting
continue.
mechanism. Yes.
Our opticians are in the private sector.
Again, some of it is through NHS contracting, but yes.
Our GPs are independent contractors. They're not,
and have been since 1948.
Indeed, famous battle with Bevan.
Yeah.
They're not employed directly by the state. So on drugs, dentists, opticians and GPs, we aren't going to be a fully publicly provided service.
I know, but we're restoring what used to happen pre the Health and Social Care Act. So, for example, at the moment, you've got a situation where a non-emergency ambulatory contract in Sussex can go to a firm that doesn't own any ambulances, who subcontract to 20 other firms, who want 2 of the firms go bust, and patients are left stranded on their doorsteps when they're supposed to be picked up for dialysis appointments.
I understand, and you wouldn't do that.
It is examples like that.
Right.
We want to restore those sorts of contracts back to the public sector. We're not talking about upending the 1948 settlement and nationalising GPs.
Provided service. Well, let me ask you this. The NHS sometimes goes to private medical providers for operations, hip replacements and so on, because it helps add to the capacity of the NHS. Will that go?
Well, I mean, I don't like it. I'd rather it was done in the public sector, but I'm realistic and pragmatic enough to know that I've got to build up capacity in a public NHS. Well, it's going to have to remain in the short term.
Well, we spend about £9 billion on it a year.
Well, it's going to have to remain in the short term, because I cannot say to somebody in a mental health crisis who needs a bed, I'm sorry, you cannot have a bed in the public mental health facility because the beds have been cut by 5,000 under the Tories, and we're not going to send you to a private provider. I don't want it to happen, but I've got to build up capacity in the public sector first.
All right, that's clear enough. Labour claims that a free trade deal with America, should it ever come, would add £500 million a week to the NHS drugs bill. Why do you scare people with this sort of fake news?
Because this was the estimate put forward by the academic in the dispatches programme.
But you've just accepted it as a Labour claim now. But Mr Corbyn has said that it may be an underestimate. So it's now your claim. You've even put it virtually on the side of a bus.
Yeah, it's not on a real bus.
But the figure's not true, is it?
But it's an estimate because we know that we know. I mean, Donald Trump has stood up and he has said that we want pharmaceutical prices in the US to go down by making other countries pay more.
But even in the unlikely event that a British government was to agree to rising drug prices from America, we only import 10% of our drugs from America. That 500 million figure of 500 billion a week assumes all our drug prices go to American levels, whether they come from Britain, Europe or Asia. It's a nonsense.
Well, it's not a nonsense, because if the US want the terms of a trade deal that we bust our regulatory regime for pharmaceuticals, so the NHS is forced to buy US pharmaceuticals at higher prices.
Why would it be forced to buy at higher prices?
Well, what leverage have we got in a trade deal with the US when we're a smaller
economy? Because we would continue to buy from the loss. It is inconceivable that any British government would agree to a doubling of the total drugs bill. That's what the 500 million figure depends on. It's a nonsense.
It's not a nonsense, Andrew. If the US have said one of their primary objectives of a trade deal with us is to get into our pharmaceutical market and undermine our regulatory regime...
No, but excuse me, are you telling me that America would dictate to any British government the price, not just of American drugs, which is only 10%, but of the other 90% as well.
But we've got a regime since the 1950s to keep drug prices down.
I understand.
The US want us to unpick that.
For American drugs.
Yeah, so the NHS buys American drugs at higher levels, higher prices.
Let's be honest here, because I remember you were very critical of the Brexiteers' claim that we'd save 350 million a week by leaving the EU. They did put it on the side of a real bus. I mean, I remember taking that figure apart during the referendum. But your 500 million a week is an even bigger lie than Boris Johnson's 350 million.
But it's not our figure. An academic...
You've adopted it.
An academic suggested that this is what this would happen.
And that becomes Labour policy. That becomes a Labour claim.
Well, I think we have a duty to explain to people this is what experts in the field
Have you tested that figure? Did you know it assumed that all our drug prices went to American levels?
No, it's not. We're not.
Did you know that?
It does not. The figure does not say that it's all going to go to the US. It said it could have the implication of doubling the drugs bill for the NHS. Some of that will be US pharmaceuticals.
All right.
Other bits of it will be other pharmaceutical companies from elsewhere in the world.
All right. Well, I'll be speaking to the academic who came up with this figure on Politics Live tomorrow. It may be worth watching when you see how the 500 million figure is like Mr. Johnson's 350. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now, Jeremy Corbyn's been in Scotland today. He said that there would be no second referendum on Scottish independence in the first term of a Labour government, which could go on to 2024. Let's speak now to the SNP's David Linden. He joins us from Glasgow. David Linden, what's your reaction to Mr. Corbyn's words?
Well, I think we'll have to wait and see what happens at the general election on the 12th of December. The SNP is certainly polling very well at the moment. We're on course to have a good election. And of course, going into that election campaign, Andrew, we're talking about giving Scotland the right to choose its own future. So it would well behove a Labour leader, bear in mind that Labour helped set up the devolved Scottish Parliament, to deny our devolved Scottish Parliament, which has already voted for an independence referendum. So I think Mr Corbyn, is having a pretty desperate day here in Scotland. It's not gone particularly well. But if Jeremy Corbyn is seriously suggesting that he won't respect the mandate of the SNP in 2016, 2017 and the Scottish Parliament, and what I think will be in the 12th of December, then I think you'll find that that is a very foolish thing to do.
So if he sticks to that line and needs SNP support for a Queen's speech, for a finance bill, for a vote of confidence, he won't get it.
Well, we've been very clear to all parties in Westminster that if they want SNP support, then they shouldn't bother picking up the phone unless they're willing to offer a Section 30 order. But we're absolutely clear that we do not want to...
Which is a second referendum on Scottish independence.
Absolutely it is,
right.
And that's because people in Scotland have voted for that on numerous occasions now.
Now, you want a second Brexit referendum, and as you've said, you want a second independence referendum. But if Remain won the second Brexit referendum, what would be the case for a second independence referendum?
Well, I think as you've seen over the last few years in UK politics, Brexit has absolutely dominated the agenda. And even if Remain was to win in a second referendum, which I very much hope that it does, it's crystal clear that we would see probably a decade of Brexit chaos at Westminster. And that just makes the case.
What if we voted to Remain, there would be a decade of Brexit chaos?
Absolutely. I think that the Brexit parties and the Tory party would still wrangle over that. And I think one of the things we've seen throughout the Brexit process, Andrew, is that Westminster parties have consistently ignored Scotland. That's Scotland where 62% of the population
But I'm not asking about that,
because
what I'm asking about is if we voted to Remain in a second referendum, what would be the material change in Scotland's circumstances? Because you said after the last referendum there had to be a material change. If we don't leave the EU, what is the material change?
Well, I think people in Scotland are now having another look at how Westminster treats Scotland, and we've seen throughout the Brexit process how shoddily that Scotland has been treated. But there's a whole series of other factors that have changed. I mean, I remember during the independence referendum, leaflets going through doors in the East End of Glasgow telling people about the UK's AAA credit rating. Well, we don't have that AAA credit rating anymore, and we saw that from Moody's only last week as well.
What do you
think
I
would argue is that the UK
what do you think an
independent
Scotland's credit rating would be with the largest deficit in Europe?
We've certainly been very clear in the Growth Commission the direction of travel that we want to go. We'd head to having a deficit of around about 7.1% by 2021, and that's in line with the Growth Commission figures. So we're very confident about the economics of independence, and that's all been set out in the Growth Commission report.
No, the Growth Commission said you had to cut your fiscal deficit, and it would take years to do, and there would have to be spending restraint to do it.
Well, I think one of the other things that it talks about in the Growth Commission is the need to grow our economy and to grow our population. And one of the other problems that we have with Westminster is an inability to control our own immigration policies. Because, for example, we see Westminster parties that are obsessed with limiting free movement of people, which is absolutely crucial for Scotland's economy. So we're absolutely clear going forward that we need to grow our economy.
How would you get this
population.
7% deficit down?
Well, we're very clear that there are a whole factor of things in the Growth Commission.
So just be clear about one thing. Tell me, how would you get the deficit down?
Well, we're certainly looking to grow our population, as I've outlined to you, Andrew.
Right, but that would take a long while. And you want to join Europe? Yep. That could take 10, 20 years to have an impact on GDP. So how are you going to get the 7% deficit down to be acceptable to the European Union?
Well, actually, one of the things that the Brexit process has done has opened doors for us in the European Union. We're having conversations with colleagues in Brussels that are going much better than.
But how are you going to get it down?
So we're very, very clear that yes, our intention is to join Europe sooner rather than later, and that makes the case that Scotland is a European nation, and people embraced that in 2016 during the referendum when they voted 62%.
Yeah, but I'm asking you about the fiscal deficit. The European rules say it can't be more than 3%. You're at 7%. What cuts in spending, what taxes would you raise to follow Europe's fiscal rules?
Well, we've been absolutely clear, Andrew, in the Growth Commission what we intend to do in terms of our economy. But one of the main things that we have to do is have full control, full economic control, which we don't have at the moment because we're operating with one hand tied behind our back.
So you've got full control. What spending would you cut and what taxes would you raise?
Well, for example, we've spoken about ending the need for nuclear weapons stationed only 50 miles here from the River Clyde. That would certainly free up a fair bit of money.
Well, how much?
Well, you know, I'm sure you've got the figures in front of you.
Well, how much?
I don't have that particular figure in front of me, but there are a number of things that we would do to try and grow our economy.
It would save you around 600 million, and of course you would lose 12,000 jobs.
No, that's not actually true, because Faslane would be the tri-service headquarters.
So you would still be spending more money in defence, so there's no spending there.
Well,
you would take the Trident money and you would spend it on conventional forces.
The 2% required of GDP by NATO, but we would not be spending it on nuclear weapons. We're very clear about that.
So your deficit's £10 billion. Trident may or may not save you 600 million. Where does the other 9.3 billion come from?
Well, that will be for an independent Scottish Government to look at, but we've been very, very clear in the Growth Commission the direction of travel that we want to take our economy in. But of course, before we can do any of that, we have to have the right to choose our own future.
Yeah, but I'm asking you, what would you do if you had your own future? Let me ask you another question, because I'm not getting anywhere here. If you get your independence, what would the Scottish currency be?
We've been very clear that we intend to use the pound.
But London, Westminster, may not allow you to be part of a monetary union. So you would use the pound the way Panama uses the dollar. It would be a sterlingization process.
We've been very, very clear that we would not be in a formal currency union. Again, that is outlined in the Growth Commission document.
So if you're not in a formal monetary union, but you're using the pound, you would have to follow to the letter British monetary and interest rate policy.
No, that's not the case.
Well, how could you use the pound if you didn't?
We're very clear in the Growth Commission that we intend to use the pound, and I think that any
so you'd have to have English
UK
interest rates and English monetary policy to follow it, because you couldn't print your own currency.
No, that's not entirely true. I mean,
you couldn't print the pound.
But we already use both English and Scottish notes here. Yeah. We are intent in using the pound after independence, and that's been outlaid in the Growth Commission report.
Why don't you want the euro?
Well, there are 19 countries in the Eurozone, the European Union, that use the euro out of 27. There are a number of European countries, whether that's
Sweden, but why don't
Denmark.
You want the euro?
Well, we're very clear that we want to continue using the pound, and I don't see any reason
You keep
why
on
we
saying
can't
you're
do
very
that.
clear, but actually you don't answer the questions. What's wrong with using the euro if you want to be such good Europeans?
Well, we've made very, very clear that we want to continue using the pound. That's the overwhelming message that we hear out in the doorsteps, and that's something that we're reflecting. I think that it couldn't be any clearer than that. We will be using the pound after independence, Andrew.
But not as part of a monetary union with the rest of the UK?
That is what we've outlined in the Growth Commission, yes.
All right. Very well. David Linden, thanks for joining us tonight. I'll be back here with Politics Live at 12 o'clock tomorrow, and the Andrew Neil Show will be back same time, same place next week here on BBC Two. Bye-bye.